The views and opinions expressed by the guests or hosts of this program do not necessarily reflect those of Divine Mercy Radio, Incorporated.
Introducing you to people across North Carolina and around the world who put their Catholic faith into action. This is Faith Works on Catholic 540 AM Divine Mercy Radio. Now, here's your host for Faith Works, Ellen White.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to DrOnCall on Catholic 540 AM Divine Mercy Radio. Here we look at medical news and trends that impact all of our lives from a Catholic perspective. I'm your host, Ellen White, with our Doctor on Call, Dr. Patrick O'Connell. Dr. Pat has been practicing medicine in the Raleigh area since 2006, joining Duke Health as a primary care physician, and in 2017 founded Sentinel Primary Care. Dr. O'Connell has a certification in Catholic healthcare ethics from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Dr. O'Connell is an underwriter of Divine Mercy Radio. Hello again, Dr. Pat.
Hello, Ellen.
So for those listeners that weren't able to join us last time, we discussed diet and nutrition. So this episode will be a follow-up to our last discussion. And various subtopics included, calories, macronutrients, great discussion on good versus bad fats, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, and what the various types of foods and what they are, what they do to our bodies. And finally, fad diet. A fantastic episode, and I highly recommend you go back and check it out if you haven't listened to it, and you can do that in the local section on our website, and I'll mention that again at the end of the interview. So, Dr. Pat, let's start with some discussion on vitamins, specifically vitamin D, omega-3, fish oil, zinc, calcium. What are your thoughts on vitamins in general and what they can do for us?
Yep. So in way broad overview, a handful of kind of framing thoughts. So one is that vitamin deficiency is bad. Lots of negative health outcomes from being short on various vitamins. Vitamin sufficiency is good. A lot of the question, though, that we address in kind of a Western setting is, what about extra amounts of vitamins? Mm-hmm. So deficiency, sufficiency, and, if you will, supra-sufficiency. Supra-sufficiency, by and large, doesn't help. So you don't want to be deficient, but lots of extra vitamins above and beyond your needs, by and large, don't add anything extra. So that's a general kind of framing comment on this.
Well, let me interject for a second and ask you, would you recommend then that you initially, if you're interested, that you initially get tested to see what your levels are, and then take them if you're deficient in some, and then get retested again to make sure you're not supra?
You could. That can be an expensive proposition.
Right.
Some vitamin blood tests are cheap. Some vitamin blood tests are not cheap.
Okay.
So you can easily hit $1,000 on lab tests without even really trying, and without even having tested a lot of different nutrients. But it is an approach, or a person could be targeted based on a suspicion or their dietary pattern, or I guess all of this leaves out a medical condition that puts a person at risk of a given deficiency. For example, if somebody has a digestive system disease where they can't absorb certain nutrients, that's a different scenario. And in that case, actually monitoring for different nutrients may be part of the normal follow-up. But just as good general health measures, sort of what we're talking about here, you could do that, but because of the expense, I think it's probably not done very often. So what I think lots of Americans spend lots of money doing is taking a multivitamin, which is reasonable, probably not helpful in general, but it's hard to overcome that intuitive appeal that if there's some gap in your nutrients that somehow you're missing, the multivitamin helps to fill in the gap. So that intuitive appeal is hard to overcome, or hard to conclusively say, no, that never works. But I will say that when researchers have looked at a multivitamin versus not a multivitamin, it's hard to show benefit. So it's not clear that it adds to people's health.
Okay, so let's get back to the individual ones then.
Yeah.
Talk about so let's start with vitamin D. What are your thoughts on taking a vitamin D supplement?
So I think vitamin D has probably the biggest track record of disappointing us all compared to any other vitamin on planet Earth in recent memory.
Well, I vaguely remember discussing this at great length about during COVID, or the issues that we were having with COVID. A lot of people were thinking that taking vitamin D would be
yes. And so with vitamin D, a lot of the real interest in vitamin D came about probably about 15 years ago. It really started in earnest, and there is association with low vitamin D, and numerous diseases have worse outcomes in the person who has low vitamin D, or the disease has a worse manifestation, raising the hypothesis that maybe vitamin D is causing the problem or aggravating the problem, or supplementing vitamin D would fix the problem. And almost without fail, every single time vitamin D supplementation has been tested therapeutically for fill-in-the-blank disease, it didn't make a difference. It doesn't help. So what we can say with vitamin D is low vitamin D keeps company with a lot of bad things from a health standpoint, but it doesn't seem to be the cause of almost any of them. It's more a marker that something's up with this person, or maybe as a function of their health being not so good, they're not outdoors very much, or something. It's not clear what the association is, but it by and large, low vitamin D doesn't seem to be the cause of, or rather supplementing vitamin D doesn't seem to be the solution to any variety of health conditions. The one that does hold true, though, is low vitamin D, particularly very low vitamin D, is bad for your bones. And so adequate vitamin D is then good for your bones over the long term.
Okay, so, I wonder, even going forward, if you're going to have the same response with all of these?
There's some stuff that we can say about individuals, but again, it's to that theme that if you're getting your vitamins through your diet, then taking supplemental vitamins above and beyond your diet probably doesn't have much of a role to play. Well,
then maybe the question should be, as a general rule with the American diet or the Western diet that the majority of the people eat, I don't think it's adequate nutrition. So why not supplement with a vitamin?
Because, on the one hand, with the Western diet, we don't have to deal with food scarcity. But because of a lot of the foods that have been marketed and made tastier with high fructose corn syrup, a lot of times the things we choose are not necessarily terribly nutritious for us. And then that speaks to the issue of a multivitamin and its intuitive appeal, even though I can't say for certain that it's helpful, but it's rational.
Yeah. But what about omega-3?
So omega-3, it's a very interesting story. I won't go too much into the details, but the synopsis version is medicinally omega-3 fatty acids, aka fish oil, krill oil, DHA, and EPA. Those are all terminology that all swims together. Probably not helpful medicinally for cardiovascular disease as its primary application.
Okay.
It all started many years ago when researchers observed that people who ate more oily fish had less heart disease than anticipated. And so a lot of research, the theory was it's the omega-3 fatty acids. But then when omega-3 fatty acids have been tested as a pharmaceutical product, the results have been mixed, but most of the time don't show benefit. There are a couple of circumstances where omega-3 fatty acids do get used medicinally, but in general, they also have not been as successful as people were hoping 15 or 20 years ago. So, and then humorously enough, I saw yet another study a year or so ago that said, hey, people who eat more oily fish have fewer heart attacks than expected. I'm like, that's where this whole thing started. So
coming back
eat your salmon.
Yeah, right. And I just, it keeps coming back to the simple things, doesn't it? Eat a well-balanced diet.
That is it.
Exercise, get sleep. I think we make it too complicated.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on zinc? There's been a lot of discussion about zinc, especially in the midst of this COVID stuff.
Yeah. So zinc, there are some circumstances where infants and children can be zinc deficient. This is one that if there are certain digestive system diseases, you can develop zinc deficiency, which can cause a variety of problems. Zinc as a supplement has been mostly looked at in the context of viral respiratory illnesses. And there is some research to suggest benefit for colds, kind of broadly written, maybe shaving off half a day of illness or something like that. So reasonable to take in that circumstance. By extension, it's been proposed for COVID. I don't know of any direct research for zinc with COVID. But I think some people extrapolate from the data with colds. Viewing it as a low toxicity, low side effect strategy for treating COVID, and extending from the research looking at colds. So a caveat that would go with zinc is, very interestingly, zinc and copper are absorbed by the same mechanisms in the GI tract. And people who take large doses of zinc over the long term, it outcompetes the absorption of copper, and copper deficiency then can cause neuropathy. So there's a little bit of a caveat in taking lots of zinc for the long term, and an unintended side effect there.
What are your thoughts on calcium supplement?
Yeah, so for most people as a supplement, probably not tons of benefit. Calcium is, the story with calcium is an interesting finger pointing at the medical community, because it was one that got caught up in the whole mindset of saying, well, it logically makes sense, so therefore we're going to recommend that you do it. And so lots of professional organizations recommended calcium supplementation based on logic, and with the goal being to reduce osteoporosis and fractures. When the data caught up with it, it's not so clear that a calcium supplement's all that helpful. Adequate calcium in your diet, coming back to that theme, is good for your bones. Supplemental calcium, it's less clear cut. Maybe improves bone density a little bit, but it's harder to show a reduction in fractures as a consequence. So it is fair to consider a calcium supplement for someone who maybe has low calcium intake in their diet, or again, digestive diseases where absorption of calcium is problematic. But as a general health measure for a general person, probably not of much benefit, and might increase your chance of kidney stones, which is a big downside.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay. Well, just to reiterate, your feelings on multivitamins, are they not really beneficial?
Yeah, that's kind of it. So, as we've said throughout this whole couple of shows, is eat your nutrients as food. Yeah. Eat good, healthy food. I think that's the starting point. Okay,
so some questions that we got from our audience. Yeah. Let's start with those. These are all, I kind of run the gamut. So the first one is, how do I determine a healthy weight for me?
That's a good question. So not knowing the particulars of the person who wrote the question, I will answer more generally, but there's a couple of ways that have been used. So the most common is the body mass index. So that's a way of coming up with a number that compares people of different heights. And so it's a simple mathematical equation. It's weight in kilograms divided by height in, I think, meters. And it generates this abstract number. So body, and you can go online. So if you go to your search engine and type body mass index, you can come up with a calculator for it. So it's on the low end is this abstract number of 18.5, up to 25 is the upper end of normal. And the idea is if you have a body mass index less than 18.5, you're underweight, and 25 and above, and you are overweight. 30 is the threshold for defining obesity medically. So, and the body mass index is a decent tool for looking at a healthy weight. It's not perfect, but it's decent. The pitfalls of it are somebody who's very muscular is going to fall off the heavy end of the body mass index, even though their percent body fat maybe 3%. Conversely, if a person is, say, elderly and has very low muscle mass, sort of a thin person, they may look like they've got a great, healthy, nice, thin body weight and a body mass index of 20, but they're actually low muscle and sort of frail. So there's a couple of pitfalls with a body mass index, but as a general tool for many members of the population, I mean, it's decent. So the body mass index. And then another one that has been used is the waist circumference. Waist circumference, it's the distance around at the top of your hip bones, which roughly corresponds to the level of your belly button. What that one is getting at, and just to mind that it's not your pants size, because pants tend to ride a little lower. Mm-hmm. It's higher than where your pants would fall. So like if you feel the sides of your pelvis and you go as high as you can, which is again about the level of the belly button, that's what's being measured in the waist circumference. And so what that one's really getting at is that phenotype of central weight, or the apple-shaped person who's overweight. That central distribution of weight is metabolically less healthy than weight that is, say, lower down in the hips and legs, for example. Interesting. So there's more metabolic detriment to carrying your weight in your belly than there is, say, on your hips or in your legs.
That's why, and I'm not being... I don't know what to say, but with guys, when they have a beer belly, mm-hmm. that's really not healthy because it's centrally located in that area.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes, absolutely. And then another metric that's kind of a version of that is the waist to hip ratio. So you measure at the waist, then you measure at the hip, so down lower, a little below where your pants would fall. That one kind of gets at the same idea, but mathematically it doesn't add any risk prediction to just a waist measurement, waist circumference. So waist circumference then is the other one that gets used in addition to body mass index.
So body mass index, waist circumference, those are the two. And I was going to say too, when you were talking about the BMI, mm-hmm. Whenever I would use it as a reference point for me, it seemed like the weight that was at the higher end, or, I was supposed to be in the middle of whatever weight it was that it was suggesting. And at that weight, it was the weight that I felt the heaviest. Isn't that funny? Mm-hmm. And I was going to say mm-hmm. too, wouldn't you agree, doctor, that you kind of, as you get older, you kind of know when you feel like you're carrying some extra pounds. Is that generally true? I don't know. Maybe it's
I think so.
So that's kind of a gauge for me for my healthy weight. I know when I feel a little sluggish.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I will, if I'm seeing somebody in the office who has really put in the effort and has lost weight, and I'll often ask, just out of curiosity, do you feel better? Do you feel different? And the answer is usually yes, I feel better. So there's something subjective in that self-assessment that really gets at better health.
Yes, right. The energy, just more spunk. I get it. For sure. Mm-hmm. All right. So the next question that we have, and we touched on this ad nauseum with the first interview or the installment of this. So I would highly recommend that the listeners go back to the podcast on diet and nutrition. But the question is, what should I eat? Just what should I eat?
Yeah.
We covered that at great length the last time, but you go ahead and summarize it again.
Well, that's the person who listened to the great length and is like, oh my gosh, that was too much talking. Just boil it down. What should I eat?
There you go.
So the boiled down answer is a couple components. There's not a specific dietary pattern that's the good one. So there's multiple ways to eat that are healthy. The second is, in general, a healthier collection of foods is good. So it doesn't mean no chips, no sweets, but limited amounts, moderate amounts, with other stuff that's good for you. So vegetables, fruits, meats in moderate amounts, sort of the in moderation kind of approach. And then there is lots of info that we talked about in our last session on that. But again, it gets to that idea of to eat your nutrients rather than taking them as supplements. But if you eat a good overall healthy diet, that's a great starting point.
Yeah, my takeaway from our last discussion, Doctor, is that there's no one size fits all, and your response typically to your patients is, well, how do you feel? Does it work for you? Okay, then. Mm-hmm. And I really like that. It's not so strict. And you can have that little piece of chocolate cake if you want. Okay, next question. How many calories should you burn a day to lose weight?
Boy, that's some complexity to that question, not to make it overly complex, but I'll throw in the other part, which is calorie intake that goes with that. So if somebody's aiming to lose weight, a goal you could shoot for a calorie deficit, if you can run a deficit of 400, 500 calories a day, that's pretty good. That's going to get you on a tempo for roughly a pound a week of weight loss, somewhere in that ballpark. So then you got to calculate, well, if I want to get a deficit of 400 or 500, how much am I eating? How much am I burning? What do I need to modify? Mm-hmm. Now, to maintain adequate nutrient intake, you probably need to be eating at least something like 1,000 or 1,200 calories a day just to get enough food with enough nutrients in it to maintain nutritional intake. So then you can kind of do the math then to figure out, well, so that's going to mean 1,400 to 1,600 of calorie expenditure per day to achieve deficit. And then you can sort of modify that up and down according to body size and exercise. And but those kind of numbers get you in the ballpark.
I like it. So eating 1,000 to 1,200. Burning 1,400 to 1,600. That's really cool. It's an easy way of doing it. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And by the way, 1,000 calories a day. That's not much food. Yeah.
Crumbs. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Okay. So is cardio or strength training better for weight loss? I think they're both good.
Yeah, honestly, that's the answer is yes, both. So, what we think of for weight loss is like the previous question: how many calories do you need to burn? How do I burn calories? I do cardiovascular exercise. However, if you're aiming to lose weight, you get benefit from both strength training and cardio. So both are valuable, and they're complementary to each other. So if you do cardio as and again, this ties into like we talked about last time, is doing exercise that you like, or at least not doing exercise that you hate, because you can't keep that going. So assuming all exercise is equal to a given individual, if a person chooses cardio as their exclusive way for weight, then on an hour-by-hour basis of exercise, you're probably going to burn more calories out for a run than you will doing some strength training. Mm-hmm. However, you're only burning the calories while you're out for your run. Conversely, if somebody chooses strength training, their hourly calorie expenditure while they're doing their weights is probably less than the person who's out running, but by adding muscle mass, the person is boosting their resting metabolic rate, so they burn more calories hour after hour after hour just sitting there.
Right.
And then if you put those two together, you do some strength training, so you build some muscle. Then when you do your cardio, you have more muscle with which to burn fuel. So the two together are a good combination. So again, all things being equal, a person who is equally fine with doing some strength training and some cardio, the answer of which one is better is yes. They're both good. They're both valuable.
As a runner, and when I initially started, I had very little time to do anything other than running.
Yes.
And it used to drive me crazy. And I hurt my foot, so I just started a couple of months ago doing some strength training, and I haven't been able to run. So I get this whole thing, and I can't wait to put them both together. I'm really excited, but yeah, I like the whole metabolic resting and it's calories.
Like, wait, I can do this while I just read or watch TV? Give me the weights.
Okay. Moving on. How much dietary protein would you recommend for a client with type 2 diabetes?
So this one sounds like has the questioner has a specific person in mind, to which I would say, talk with a client's doctor. But in general, there's actually not a really narrowly restricted, or it's the wrong word. There's not a really narrowly prescribed diet for folks with type 2 diabetes. So there's a lot of leeway for carbohydrates or protein or fats. Like we talked about last time, simple sugars, the carbohydrates that are sweet on the tongue, those are going to jump your sugars up. Whereas complex carbohydrates that take a long time to digest don't have that same effect. So while you can make a case to say less of the simple sugars, there's not really any consensus or strength of research to say this amount of protein or avoid all of these carbohydrates or have this much fat. There's a fair amount of leeway that's built into it. Mm-hmm. So reduction of simple sugars and calorie reduction as appropriate to the person, to the individual patient, is kind of the general theme of diet and diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Okay.
And this is somewhat related, but even before I get into that, it relates to children and nutritional approaches to prevent from developing diabetes. What has been your experience lately, Dr. Pat, with patients or obesity in children? Do you feel like that epidemic has slowed down a little bit?
It's a good question. I don't know. I don't, in my own practice, I see adults, so I don't try to keep up with what's going on in the pediatrics world. But, when adults, unfortunately, it's been a struggle nationally for decades with increasing weight on average. And I think it's the same for kids, but I don't know what the more recent trends are and if it's slowing down. I certainly hope that it is, but I don't know.
I do too. It just seems like more children are fit. I don't know. Maybe I'm just around more active kids. Okay. So the question is, what kind of nutritional approach would you take to help children who are at risk of developing diabetes?
Yeah. So again, I don't do pediatrics, but so two components of this. So one for the two different types of diabetes. So there's type 1 diabetes, which is the one where the immune system destroys the cells that manufacture insulin. That's commonly the one that develops during childhood, although it can happen later. And then type 2 diabetes, which is the one that typically comes on in adulthood and is related to obesity. So the development of type 2 diabetes in childhood would be incredibly rare. It would be incredibly rare. There, it's I would imagine more for the sake of the long-term health of the kid as the child grows into adulthood and helping them, have better eating patterns, more, say, nutritional knowledge so that they understand healthier foods and less healthier foods and kind of get it in terms of food choices so that it's not going to prevent them from getting type 2 diabetes in childhood because they probably weren't going to get that anyway, but it may help them when they're old enough to come see me, and certainly avoiding diabetes when you're coming to see me is a good thing. So from that standpoint, more exercise, healthier foods, sodas, junk food, all the stuff that kids gravitate towards, that I gravitated towards. So Now, the other part of this would be, and maybe this is what the questioner was asking, is type 1 diabetes, the autoimmune diabetes, where the immune system attacks the pancreas. So here, from a dietary standpoint or nutritional standpoint, and I do not know the latest on this, but there has been theories of what is it that triggers type 1 diabetes to occur, and various environmental exposures have been postulated, and diet has been suggested, and some researchers apparently have looked at constituents of cow's milk as possible risk factors for diabetes, type 1 diabetes. From the little bit that I looked up on this, there does not appear to be enough research to say, yes, this is a risk factor, and certainly not enough to make any kind of dietary recommendations like, oh, this kind of milk, or don't drink milk, or milk before this age or after that age. So I would imagine that's one where, stay tuned, and maybe in years to come we'll know more. Right.
Okay. And finally, what nutritional recommendations would you have or would you make for vegetarians?
Yeah, this is an important question. So, because as we've talked about a lot before, it's like, just eat your nutrients. But for a person who is vegetarian, or more specifically vegan, there's the potential for nutrient deficiencies that you would want to be mindful of. So the two that most prominently rise to the top would be B12 deficiency, particularly in vegans, and then calcium intake inadequacy in vegetarians and vegans, with implication then for bone density and long-term fracture risk. Right. So B12 as a food nutrient is found exclusively in animal products. So it's not going to be found in a purely vegetable-based diet. So therefore, a person who is vegan would have to seek out sources of B12, and a B12 supplement would fill the gap. Calcium, depending on what the vegetarian person's diet looks like, there may be calcium deficiency. We talked earlier about calcium supplements, and it's not really clear they're beneficial, but calcium in your diet clearly does link to bone density and osteoporosis risk and long-term fracture risk. And so the risk is that if a person has too little calcium intake, their bones may pay the price, because your bones then become your reservoir for the calcium that you're not eating. So that's a scenario where if a person's dietary calcium intake, food calcium intake is low, then maybe a supplement does make sense for that person. Mm-hmm. That's when you talk it over with your doctor. Don't say, I heard it on the radio, but talk it over with your doctor. But that's a scenario where you could make a case to say, yeah, calcium supplement may be an appropriate thing to do.
Okay. And this is a question for me, especially in the midst of where we are right now with COVID, and it seems like the numbers are rising again. How's the office doing?
So we're okay because home COVID tests are now available. There are not many people coming into the office for testing, but the numbers are definitely going up. There was a lull in springtime where nobody in the practice was getting COVID, but that has changed, and so I definitely am fielding questions every day and emails every day from either people who have COVID or have questions about it or had an exposure and are looking for advice. So it's picking back up for sure.
And back up, and patients are doing okay overall, though?
Yeah. So far, at least in the experience of the practice, I've had a couple of people who've gotten significantly, one person very dangerously sick, but thankfully no one in the practice has succumbed to COVID.
Right. Thankfully. Okay. All right.
Yes.
So as we finish this discussion on diet and nutrition, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share, Dr. Pat?
Yeah. So to say again, healthy diet, so important. Eat your nutrients, eat a good healthy diet, and that is such an important starting point. And then for some people in certain circumstances, supplements can be useful, but also as a general rule of thumb, they have generally not been the panacea that folks would hope for, which again goes back to that idea that deficiency is bad, sufficiency is good, and supra-sufficiency is probably just funding the vitamin makers.
Good point. Okay. And again, Dr. Pat, where can our listeners go to get in touch with you or find out more about your practice at Sentinel Primary Care?
Yeah, so the practice, Sentinel Primary Care, is also the website, sentinelprimarycare.com, or you can just search my name, Patrick O'Connell, Raleigh, or Sentinel Primary Care Raleigh, and I'll come up on somewhere on the first page.
Awesome. Okay, that's it for this episode of Dr. On Call on Catholic 540 AM Divine Mercy Radio. Our thanks to Dr. Pat for sharing his insight with us today. We want to remind all of our listeners that if you have any non-emergency medical question that you would like Dr. Pat to address on a future show, simply email us at info@catholic540am.org. That's info@catholic540am.org. If you missed any part of today's program, you can play our past shows by going to catholic540am.org and click on local programs. You can also listen to our radio show and podcast on our Divine Mercy Radio smartphone app, available via the Apple App Store or Google Play. Simply search Divine Mercy Radio NC and download it for free. The Executive Director of Divine Mercy Radio is Cecilia Flannery. Our Director of Programming is Peter K. O'Connell. Our engineer is Keith Flannery. I'm Ellen White. Thank you so much for listening. Stay healthy and God bless.